When anthropologists compare groups of humans across space and time, our common sense ideas about what's normal turn out to be specific to places, times, and experiences. Sometimes these differences can be translated adequately enough between human cultures, but extraterrestrial life will present vast and possibly unimaginable biological and cultural differences. Given broadly similar environmental conditions, even non human life on Earth has evolved great diversity of form, behavior, culture, and appearance. Aliens we meet will be shaped not only by their homeworld's evolutionary pressures, but also by intercultural encounters with other species over thousands or millions of years. Imagining the differences produced by variations in atmosphere, gravity, and light, along with planetary histories, cultures, and events, requires both astrobiological and anthropological imagination. Speculation about extraterrestrial life sometimes describes aliens in terms of what seems rational, common sense, natural, or familiar here on Earth. One of the lessons of anthropology, however, is that what we perceive as normal isn't universal, even on our own planet. Perhaps our extraterrestrial guests' mental, social, cultural, or physiological needs would be incomprehensible to us, or, if we did understand them, even horrific or taboo. Can our earthly expectations and imaginations account for extraterrestrial possibilities? Imagine hosting visitors for whom the consumption of food is always a private affair, an act reserved for solitude, much as we set aside toilets in private rooms. Perhaps our visitors are used to being the only individuals within 100 square kilometers, or instead, prefer what we might consider very crowded conditions. Maybe they only feel comfortable when accompanied by a companion of another species, but instead of a dog or cat, it's something vastly different, like a mollusk that emits clouds of fragrant, multicolored gas on specific cycles. Our guests may even have symbiotic relationships with these creatures and always expect to meet them wherever they go. The presence of such companions could be the minimum they expect, a chance to experience the unique gases from their host's companion mollusk. What if speaking out loud is only acceptable between family members, and all other communication requires writing, dancing, remote signal transmission, or something else? How would we know? Perhaps when we host extraterrestrial life, the only way to learn will be to make mistakes, note the consequences, and then try again. Michael P. Oman Reagan in How to Host an Extraterrestrial.
Every culture has its ghosts, its legends, its mysteries.
From UFOs to haunted houses, psychic visions to cryptids, we explore the stories that defy explanation and what they reveal about what it means to be human.
I'm Chris Daly.
And I'm Ryan Geckner. We're anthropologists asking big questions about belief, experience, and the unknown.
This is Beyond the Human. Welcome back to Beyond the Human. So as you heard, we're talking today about extraterrestrials, much as we've been doing in our headlines episodes. We've been talking quite a bit about Three Eye Atlas and what if it had been, or could still be, we don't know.
Could still be.
What if it had been an extraterrestrial craft that had extraterrestrial intelligent life forms on it that then came to Earth? And we touched on this a little bit in one of our previous headlines episodes, but we thought, why not do a deeper dive into this and think about how anthropology would look at this and, what we might be dealing with if extraterrestrial life came here. And it is true that it could be really vastly different from us, and that's something to consider. So, if there were some extraterrestrials coming here, assuming they didn't just wipe us out entirely and everything's done, what would we learn about culture, biology? What would we do to learn these things? How would we communicate? How would we interact in general? And so we want to just talk a little bit about that. So again, our discussion is presupposing that they're not wiping us out and that their diseases are not wiping us out before we can interact with them. And that is a big supposition because as we have seen, when novel diseases enter a population, bad things seem to happen. And we can look at COVID. We can look at populating of the Americas after 1492. And we can see some really dramatic examples of how diseases wipe us out. So we're going to assume that doesn't happen. So we titled this episode Xenoanthropology. So Ryan, why don't you tell us what xenoanthropology is?
Yeah, so if you're a Star Trek fan, you may be somewhat familiar. I am not. So I was not aware that there was a term floating around in the science fiction universe that dealt with this idea of what would happen if humans went out into the universe and started studying other alien life forms like anthropologists do other cultural communities. And so xenoanthropology really is something of kind of a theoretical branch of anthropology. You will be hard pressed, I think, to find anyone who titles themselves a xenoanthropologist.
And applied
That
xenoanthropology.
would
That would
be
be a really interesting
even
thing.
that would be an even bigger stretch. If you're out there, please reach out. We'd love to have you on the podcast. But this branch would then theoretically be focused on understanding non-human intelligences and their social structures. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how anthropologists have dealt with space in their research already. But this is something that kind of can't really happen until extraterrestrial life shows up here or we go find it elsewhere, right? In a sense, it's not really a subfield in and of itself. And if you want to learn more about kind of the nuts and bolts of anthropology, you can go back to our very first episode where we kind of dive into each of the traditional subfields. Instead, xenoanthropology kind of could include each of the subfields within it, really, in a way. And so we could have a xenoanthropological archaeology, where we're doing something like Avi Loeb calls astroarchaeology, where you're looking at space junk, but also remains on other planets and things like that.
Yeah, imagine going for an archaeological dig on another planet.
Yeah.
That would be a really cool archaeological dig.
Well, and the thing that would be interesting about that too is like a lot of archaeology is based around what we know about the way that geology functions on Earth and how we can interpret the layers of things we find in the ground.
Well, certainly for dating purposes.
Yeah, yeah. And so how that would work on another planet is like a whole another can of worms. We would need an astrogeology first, really,
Oh, that would
to a
be
certain
fascinating
degree,
field.
right?
And
Because
and there are people who look at
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah.
But the other thing with astroarchaeology or xeno or xenoanthropological archae, I don't know what
That's
to
a
call
lot. Yeah, that's a lot. It's a mouthful.
it. Archaeologists looking at things in outer space.
Yes.
If we think about that also, when we do an archaeological dig, and I'm not an archaeologist, so forgive me if I'm oversimplifying, but when we do a dig on this planet, when we find different material remains, and that's what archaeologists are looking at is the material remains that are left, we create, or I should say they create theories and ideas about how things were used based on how we use them
Mm-hmm.
and what we know
Mm-hmm.
about humans and how we do things.
Right. Yeah, it's
Well,
a lot of analogy.
right. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we're dealing with an entirely foreign species
We're dealing with material culture that
that
doesn't
we have no
we have no
idea.
frame of reference to even begin to understand.
Right, because we certainly can't talk to people who are no longer there or extraterrestrials who are no longer there. So I mean, if you had a living civilization that you could ask them how things might be used, that's fine. But if you're dealing with literally just the remains, I don't even know how that would work. I don't know how you could come up with truly good theories.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be a really tough field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we'd do it. I mean,
Well,
we'd send
yeah, oh
people
yeah,
to
of course someone would do it, yeah. And then we could have biological anthropologists thinking about the remains of living organisms and understanding their evolution. And this could get us into ideas about how aliens and humans may have interacted over the past, and throughout prehistory or throughout history, both either naturally or through genetic manipulation. So all those theories we talk about on Ancient Aliens, biological anthropologists could theoretically dig into some of that and maybe get to the bottom of it or, find out that it's all bunk. Who knows?
And if you're getting into genetics, do the genetics work the same way?
Right, exactly. Yeah, right. Like we have a really strong grasp of our genome now, right? But that took a while. That's a relatively recent thing.
It did. And, would this life even be carbon based?
Right.
I mean,
There's so many, all of those assumptions, there's so many assumptions in all of this conversation that it's almost like we could have an episode about all of the assumptions
right, right.
that we make about interactions with hypothetical extraterrestrial life. Because, and we'll get to this kind of at the end, but we assume a lot about extraterrestrial life from what we know about ourselves. And I mean, to a certain degree, that's our only frame of reference. So of course we do.
Right. So of course we have to.
But if we take that, if we remember that, then the questions become so much bigger. It's like, well, are they carbon based? Well, we don't know. We could also see linguistic anthropologists very easily moving into this, conversation of how to communicate with extraterrestrial life. For example, they may not use a spoken language. In that opening excerpt, it talked about, well, maybe you only talk vocally in certain circumstances,
Or
or
maybe you never talk
maybe you
vocally.
never talk. If we, we'll talk about abductee experiences here in a bit, but a lot of abductee stories talk about telepathic communication. And that communication happens in a language that is intelligible to abductees. So maybe they don't even have a language that is their own and have some other form of intelligence where they're able to basically understand the language of the people they're around and communicate telepathically that way by going into your brain or something and like understanding how you communicate. Who knows?
So, other than linguistics, we can, of course, get into cultural anthropology.
Yes, yes.
So, understanding another species' culture, which again could be really, really challenging because there could
Yeah.
be very different things going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a similar problem with archaeology in that our
Yeah.
analogy that we have this idea of cultural universals, right? These things that we can find in every human community, regardless of where they are. And that's kind of where a lot of interactions with a group that you've never interacted with before start is kind of at the basic level of like, how are people related to each other? How do people understand their kinship and things like that?
I mean, reproduction might not even be the same.
Right.
So,
And all of that is linked in with that, right?
right.
And I mean, they could have
They could have asexual reproduction. I mean,
it
there's,
could be some sort of wild hive mind type thing where there's
right.
like not, an
You've been watching
individual in the sense.
Pluribus.
I've been watching Pluribus, and we're going to talk about that in a minute too. If you haven't watched Pluribus, you should go watch it, and there will be a point later on where you may want to skip what we're saying because I will probably spoil something.
Oh, spoilers. Why you gotta do that?
Because Pluribus is so good, you should have already watched it.
So, in a cultural xenoanthropology, we would have to start to learn the new cultural universals.
Hmm.
In Anthro, we talk a lot about these cultural universals, and they just wouldn't necessarily be true. And we would also be looking at things like social structure, behaviors, and how you're supposed to interact with other people, other species, your natural environment, all of these different things. And that's all part of kind of trying to understand the culture of a community.
Hmm.
Then, of course, we have to have medical. And so we would be looking at how these species, these extraterrestrials, understand different diseases, how they understand how you treat different diseases, what role you're supposed to take when you're sick,
Hmm.
how you're supposed to respond to that, how you're supposed to treat those diseases. Also, sort of the medical ethics of things, is genetic manipulation okay?
Right.
You know, we have a lot of discussions about that ourselves, whether or not it's okay. Another species might have entirely different ideas about those kinds of things, and also understandings about how medicine and disease processes work. And certainly that would tie to their genetics and their overall systems physiology and all of that. So you'd have this entirely new way of looking
Hmm.
at things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the one piece of this that kind of gets back to what I was saying before about our assumptions about what this extraterrestrial life will be like. You know, Anthropology, if we just want to break down like the etymology of the word itself, it is the study of humans.
That's right.
And so, unless Michael Masters is correct and extraterrestrials are us in the future, in which case, then it's fine. There
Which is a
is.
really interesting thing to talk about. We're
Yes,
not going to do that at the moment, but
at the moment. We will another day.
but
But then that assumes, right, that extraterrestrial life is some other species than humanity.
right.
And so that begs the question, can we even apply the way we think about anthropology to these other groups? And it gets tricky, right? Because there have been, how many arguments within anthropology even about whether our primate ancestors do or do not have culture.
Yeah, there's
Or not even our
tons.
ancestors, but our other relatives in our lineage.
I was going to say it's anybody,
Right.
any other primate, any Australopithecines. I
Shoot,
mean,
people even talk about whales and dolphins having
right,
culture.
right,
And that is like kind of a bone of contention for some people.
right.
And so we could think about it as a way to build on, something that's been kind of going on in cultural anthropology for a minute. It's called multi-species ethnography, where people are applying ethnographic approaches to understanding species that are different than humans, A really good example of this, if you want to read it, is a book called Decolonizing Extinction, and it's about the experiences of orangutans in sanctuaries in somewhere in Southeast Asia. Forgive me, I forget where off the top of my head, but this anthropologist, Juno Pereñas, goes over and she basically does an ethnographic study of these orangutans in this sanctuary where they're trying to breed them to save them from extinction. And, she tries to take the perspective of these orangutans, which we can argue about whether or not you could actually do that. But it's an interesting thought experiment nonetheless, and really useful for this conversation if we're thinking about, okay, what if we're not able to communicate with them in a way that is different than the way, say, we communicate with other animals on Earth? Like, then that opens up like a whole nother question because we assume that they're going to be just like us.
Right. And that they will be able to somehow will be able to translate our language.
Yeah, right. Which is a crazy process if you do any digging into what that's like. And any of the examples we have just here on Earth, where physiologically, no matter who you were interacting with on the other side of the world, had the same physiology for communicating with you as you did with them. And so, like we said, the layers of assumptions here are just crazy.
And I mean, we feel pretty comfortable saying that dolphins have some form of language.
Yeah. Right.
But we certainly can't mimic their sounds.
Mm-hmm.
We can't understand their language. We can hypothesize about some things, but you could be running into a similar situation.
Patterns,
but you could be running into a similar situation where it just doesn't make any sense to us, even though there is some sort of language going on, some sort of communication.
It becomes a really existential question as you start to like sit here and really sit with it. It's like, oh wow, we have a lot of things that we think are going to happen that may be entirely impossible.
Right.
All of that said, there are some anthropologists who do study space. Part of research for this episode, I kind of dug into this a little bit, and some of this I was aware of, and then others of it I learned while I was thinking about what we should talk about in this episode. So for example, we have this idea of cultural astronomy, and so this has been around for a really long time, and it's essentially looking at the ways that human societies construct their beliefs, knowledge, and practices concerning the sky. So we have kind of two sort of sister fields within this, one being ethnoastronomy, and so this is cultural astronomies. So for example, basically any cultural group on Earth has ideas about what is in the cosmos, and really right down to the nitty-gritty of different constellations and different ideas about what your place might be in that universe. For example, worked with Lakota folks, and there's an idea about, when someone passes, their spirit travels for a year on the Milky Way, and then after that travel ends up in what we consider the Big Dipper, and there is a hole in the middle of the Dipper part of the Big Dipper where you pass into the next, the afterlife, right?
So part of that is about interpreting the patterns of the stars.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, you can think also about things like astrology,
right?
As part of that, trying, how people are interpreting the stars, and the same people can look at the stars and see them entirely differently.
Yeah, yeah. And then kind of the flip side of that coin is archaeoastronomy, which is just doing this with archaeological evidence. So looking at the ideas about the stars from past societies. So we can think about all of the examples of Mayan astrology and all the Central American cultures, but those are just a few examples. I mean, we could talk about ancient Egyptian astronomy and things like that.
Or you can think with the Egyptian things, you can think about like how the pyramids are
lined up.
Yep. With star formations and things like that. And that's actually quite a common thing that archaeologists look at. Okay, so you can have cultural astronomy. You can also have space anthropology or exoanthropology, and that's looking at human adaptations to space. Would you like to talk about that? I'm actually not that familiar with exoanthropology.
Yeah, so this is basically, as I was digging through all of this, I found this guy, Dr. Jack Schuster, who basically helped NASA figure out how to make living in space better for astronauts. So when they were in the process of developing the International Space Station and thinking about what that is and thinking about the idea of sending astronauts up into space and dropping them off and leaving them up there for a while, someone at NASA had the brain cells, and of course at NASA they do.
They've got a lot of brain cells.
Someone had the forethought to say, okay, what is it going to be like to live in space? And not just the physiological, like what's
I
going to happen to your muscles and your
I was going to say
bones.
they've been doing that biological stuff
Right,
for a long time, trying to understand what zero gravity does.
right. But more on the sort of human cultural, mental well-being level, right? And so
You better not be claustrophobic, I'll
you
tell
better
you
not be
that.
claustrophobic. Yeah. Dr. Schuster was kind of tasked with figuring out what they needed to do in the International Space Station to make it bearable for astronauts. And so what he did was he used comparative environments on Earth that were isolating or or put people in very confined spaces, things like Antarctic research stations, oil rigs, places where people are going for extended periods of time and having limited communication with anyone else in the world and things like that to make recommendations about what they should do on the space station. And one of the things they found in this research was that in the third quarter of whatever, if you took each of these stints of being in one of these places and you cut them into quarters, the third quarter was where
We
people
really think
start.
about things like football, don't we?
We do.
Yeah. I want to talk about the innings.
Or, we could talk about, well, it's probably economics, let's be honest. It's probably about, fiscal quarters. But anyway, we digress. He found that in the third quarter was where things started to get squirrely. People started to, break down and it became, sort of overwhelming. And some of the stuff that he found was very simple recommendations. He put together this report in the 80s, and we linked an article about his work in the show notes where he kind of details some of this. And I really found fascinating two of the recommendations. One, that astronauts need to change their underwear every day. That was not a given, apparently. so he said, well, we need to make sure they're doing that, which good for him. And the other thing is, he is the reason that on the International Space Station, there is a place where people can share collective meals. So there's a place where they can all sit together in zero G and eat together.
And that is so important. I mean, just
You don't think about it, but it is.
but culturally speaking, I mean, one of the basic things we do in anthropology when we learn about another culture, we look at what foods they're eating
Mm-hmm.
and we look at how they eat them. And
Yep.
so I don't mean like, do you use a fork or do you use chopsticks? I mean, do you eat together?
Yeah.
Do you use
Context
the
of
whole
that
context
dining experience.
yeah,
Yep.
and does the food you eat change depending on who you're eating with or
When
what
you're
time of
there.
year it is or whatever it is.
Yep. Do you
That
only eat turkey on
on
one
Thanksgiving.
Thursday of the entire year?
I have actually stopped completely making turkey on Thanksgiving and find that people like other food on that
Yeah.
day too.
Nobody really likes turkey that much. I don't think so.
It's really interesting. But that is a huge part of a basic cultural anthropology study, a basic ethnography to understand food and eating. And, when people started thinking about people going into space, the initial thought was, well, how do we get people the nutrition they need?
Right.
And that's
That's a
super
that's a
important.
legitimate question.
Right.
You cannot just jump over to the intergalactic Walmart while you're up
Right.
there in space.
But you have to think about more than just the nutrition.
Mhm.
Because you can get that nutrition in a simple sort of gruel, very liquidy
Right.
format
Right.
that would
But
be very
nobody's
easy.
having a good time eating that.
Right.
Mhm.
It would be easy to eat, but
Yes.
so
Easy in some ways, not in others.
so I mean, thinking about things like that means a lot, and it can actually really impact your mental health,
Mhm.
your how you're doing, just how
Mhm.
you're doing.
Mhm.
And that makes a lot of sense that would be important when you send someone up to the International Space Station. It would also be super important if we're sending people to other planets.
Yeah.
Because who knows what kind of food they would have. And so someone coming here might not be able to eat any of the food
Right.
we have.
Yeah.
So, when you think about how do people interact initially when they start to get to know each other, often it's let's have a meal together.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, but if you don't eat the same food, and you have totally different cultural norms about how to eat and when to eat, you can't do that. And that takes out a huge piece of how we start to interact with each other, how we become more comfortable with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be something we would really need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
But I digress.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, I think to a certain extent, if extraterrestrial intelligence were to make contact with us or come to Earth, anthropologists wouldn't necessarily have to form this whole new way of approaching understanding their cultures. But at the same time, maybe they would, maybe
Right.
we
We
would,
don't know.
because we can't really, if we assume that they are, relatively humanoid and are carbon based, then
And need
and
nutrients in a similar
in a
way
similar way
to
to the way
us.
we do, and communicate in the same way.
Right. I mean, it's a
This may not
lot of
work.
assumptions. I mean, even the nutrients that we have, not all of them are necessarily from food. I mean, vitamin D we
Right.
get primarily from the sun.
Right, true. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of things to think
Yeah.
about as you
Yeah.
go through that. So I don't even know if the basic tenets of the field of anthropology and ethnographic work in general could be used.
hmm Which is wild.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's really wild.
I think about if we were to try to study, well, I mentioned dolphins before, or
hmm
whatever species on Earth, that could be what we're dealing with. We could be dealing with an insectoid
hmm
species
hmm
that wouldn't see the same as us, wouldn't hear the same as us. Like the senses would be totally
Yeah,
different.
just sensory experience is totally different. Yeah. And so
So,
that sort of brings the question of like, what would we actually share
right, right.
with extraterrestrial life? I mean,
The answer may be nothing,
the
which is a
answer may be
great
nothing.
one.
The short answer may be nothing, and
Yeah.
that's the end of the podcast. Thanks for listening. But the long answer is a little bit more complicated, as we're kind of already unpacking. We think that I think the baseline assumption would be that they have some sort of culture, right? And we talked about this back in our first episode, this idea that culture is this system that we have of symbols that's learned and shared within a group. And we assume that that would be the case, but there we could sit here and spitball probably 100 scenarios where that might not be. I mean, for example, I got pluribus on the brain. If this extraterrestrial intelligence is some sort of hive mind, well, then their culture's not learned.
Right.
And so we would say, I think most cultural anthropologists would say, well, then that's not culture, because part of it
Yeah, I
is that it
struggle with
has to
that.
be learned,
Right,
right?
because that is part of the definition of
Right,
culture, but I struggle with that idea,
right, yeah.
because that is a
Well, could
not
we?
just ethnocentric view, that
Yes,
is a human-centric,
anthropocentric, I
anthropocentric,
think is the technical term, but yes.
anthropocentric view. So that just makes you think, well, are we even defining culture
Right,
correctly when we're
right.
talking about some
Well, and we like to
phenomenon?
argue about that too. And already, without
Yeah,
these involved,
there are so many different definitions of culture in anthropology. It is somewhat absurd,
it's awesome. I
but
love it.
fine.
It's the best. And so if we hold on to that, right, then we have to ask ourselves, how would we, if we don't, if they're not us, then how would we be able to communicate with them, right? And so I think first and foremost, we can start from the assumption that, okay, if this extraterrestrial intelligence has some sort of physiology that is at least similar to ours in the way that they communicate and make sound, then I think we can look at some examples.
So they have a larynx of some kind.
Yeah, of some kind, and some sort of vocal cord of some sort, and things like that, and a tongue and teeth. And like the thing is, once you learn about language and you learn about how much physiology is behind language, all of this falls apart. This is falling apart for me as we're recording this. And so if we hold on to some of those assumptions, we can look at examples of contact throughout human history where communication between two groups wasn't necessarily a given, at least, that two different languages were being spoken. And we have examples where pidgin languages and creoles developed. And so we can look at Tok Pisin in New Guinea, which is a really still used language throughout New Guinea that developed out of European and indigenous contact in New Guinea. Or we can even talk about Hawaiian Creole here in the States, and these are examples of two languages coming together and then developing a sort of new sort of third language that's a derivative of the two in order to communicate.
And maybe we're talking about non-spoken language. I mean, we think about
Right.
sign language.
Yeah, exactly. All the gestures, everything that you know about the way someone's communicating with
Right.
you without them even talking to you.
And that, might be very, very different.
Probably would likely be
Would
radically
likely be
different.
radically
Yeah.
different. So you think about, when we have people who can't communicate verbally, maybe because
Yeah.
they speak different languages, sometimes we use sort of gestures and things like that. Or you might have somebody who just uses a sign language to speak.
Right.
And we have a plethora of different sign languages out there
that are used in totally different contexts
Right.
sometimes that aren't. I mean, I think we take for granted the use of things like ASL, where
Right.
it's a replacement for spoken language. But that's
Right.
not always the case
No.
with sign languages around the world.
And sometimes those are a useful way to communicate with someone who can't communicate with you verbally. But in this case, I think you may have to throw it out the window. I mean, you might not even have hands.
Right. That's true. Yeah. Well, not even just hands, but like digits.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, again, this just throws so many questions out there. So, I love science fiction. I'm a huge science
Yeah.
fiction fan, but when you look at the classic science fiction out there, the majority of it, we're dealing with humanoid species
Yeah.
when you're talking about extraterrestrial life.
Mm-hmm.
And that may not be true.
Right.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Arrival.
Yeah, because that's kind of one good example of
Yeah.
science fiction
Great
dealing
movie.
with these questions, right?
Great movie. And I know not everybody agrees, but I actually really, really
No,
enjoyed it.
it's solid. It's solid.
Yeah. So this brought about a species that had a totally different way of thinking, a totally different way of communicating,
Yeah.
and it threw up a lot of barriers
Mm-hmm.
for people trying to communicate. In some cases, you may be talking about, this nonverbal communication, and part of my brain is not remembering just the movie because also having read the short story
That's right. Yeah.
that led to the movie, which is a great short story.
Yes.
But when you looked at these extraterrestrials, they used a verbal language, but it was not nearly as intricate as their written language.
Mm-hmm.
And so deciphering that written language is really an even more difficult thing to do. But you simply couldn't communicate with just that verbal language. And in some cases, at least in this case, there were sounds that couldn't be made by humans that these extraterrestrials were making. And that throws up all kinds of problems. Mm-hmm. And so if you're curious, the short story I mentioned was The Story of Your Life by Ted, is it Chiang?
Chiang, yep.
And it's a part of a larger group of short stories, but really good story.
Yeah, really good.
So what are your thoughts on Arrival?
Yeah, so I think the thing about Arrival I mean, the story is totally wild, first of all. Like the way they tell the story is crazy. Like even if you don't nerd out about the linguistic side of things. But really at the core, the story is about whether or not the way that we communicate shapes the way we see and understand the world and comprehend the world and experience the world. And this is kind of a core idea, or has been a core idea in linguistic anthropology. It's called the Sapir-Whorf theory. And it's this idea that the way that we speak and the way that we form our languages shapes the way that we do all of those things and exist in the world, right? And see the world.
I mean, essentially, language and culture are so firmly intertwined that you can't separate them.
Right.
And so if you're speaking in a certain way, you're seeing the world in a certain way, and it's all intertwined. And that in and of itself kind of it's exemplified by people going to other countries and they understand the language, but they don't think in that language.
Right.
And that it gives you a very different perspective on things. They say you really understand a language when you start dreaming in it, because then it's in your subconscious. True. And that to me says that you're really starting to understand that worldview and that culture.
Yeah. So now that we've really muddied the waters and made it really unclear about whether or not we'll be able to communicate.
And by the way, this is something anthropologists do with everything.
We're really good at ruining things.
We are ask our families. We are very good at ruining things, and we are very good at pointing out that absolutely nothing is black and white. Everything is a shade of gray.
Yes, everything. And speaking of shades of gray,
not 50.
Not 50.
No, very different. That's a very different thing.
What do we know about who might be out there in outer space based on contactee and abductee narratives.
I mean, we have to talk about the Greys.
Yeah, we have to start with the Greys, right? So, Chris, who are the Greys?
Well, there's a couple of different kinds of
Yes,
Greys,
there are.
which, when I was a kid, I didn't realize. I heard about these aliens, but so there's short and tall Greys.
Mm-hmm.
And these are really some of the most commonly discussed types of extraterrestrial intelligence. And so if we start with the short Greys, they are described as they're very slender. They have sort of tan or white or gray skin, that's
Yeah.
the name, with these very large black eyes. And so you can all picture it.
Yeah, I was gonna say the sort of stereotypical alien
yeah,
is the gray, essentially.
right. And so some of the abductee descriptions that are out there paint the shorter Greys as kind of passive
Mm-hmm.
without so much agency.
Yep.
Possibly with a hive mind mentality, but that's not, to my knowledge, that's not sort of an absolute. I've seen
Yeah, it's not
they sort of
universal
both.
across abductee
Yeah.
accounts for sure.
But these folks are acting as assistants
Mm-hmm.
in many cases to the taller Greys.
Yeah.
So when you think about the sort of traditional abductee experience that people talk about, the Greys bring the abductees into the UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who are going to be removing the clothes, bringing them through the craft. They really don't engage in communication. They don't, it's not like, I'm going to give you a tour of this place. No.
They're not your campus tour guides for the UFO, no.
Right. So if you read the book The Threat by Jacobs, that'll give you kind of a better description or a further description of some of that.
Yeah.
So if these are the assistants to the taller Greys, the taller Greys are sometimes referred to as the specialists, the doctors, and they're differentiated from these smaller ones. But they do join the abduction after the shorter Greys have performed the examination.
Yeah, typically.
So the taller Grey would come in and conduct any more complicated procedures that might happen. And so when you think about, you've probably heard these stories about hybridization experiments. So the taller Greys would be the ones potentially, harvesting sperm, harvesting eggs, implanting embryos, doing those kinds of things, or even harvesting a full fetus.
Yeah.
So the taller Greys are doing those more specialized tasks. They also have more of a personality, which is interesting to me. Yeah, they engage in dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's where some of this idea about whether or not the shorts are some sort of a hive mind
right
comes in, because a lot of the abductee accounts, and like if you read, this is common in David Jacobs' work, this is common in John Mack's work, and these are two guys that worked with abductees in the early 90s doing hypnotic regressions and things like that. Both of them kind of talk about how their patients talk about how the short Greys are this sort of distanced, they're almost mechanical is the way that they're kind of described, and that they have very specific roles and they're doing that and they're kind of have blinders onto everything else. But in comparison, the tall Greys are the ones that are sort of overseeing and kind of directing what's going on.
And I love this idea, just as a female.
Yes.
There is some possibility, some people talk about the differentiation might be that the tall Greys are the females and the short Greys are the males. And given that the tall Greys are in charge, seem to be performing the more intelligent tasks, etc., I can get behind that.
Yeah. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I think about, given the hive mind comparison, right? This sort of begs the question, could the Greys be some sort of have some sort of eusocial system like ants or bees, where you think about it, there's one queen, she's bigger and looks a little bit different than all the rest, but not completely different. And then all of the drones.
So is there something like that going on here now? I haven't necessarily heard that there's just like one tall and a bunch of short.
Right, exactly.
But something like that could be going on.
It could be physical ET hives, gray hives.
And
that's wild.
That is a very interesting thought.
Right.
Because that would be a culture that we would be very not used to. And how to interact properly would be a tough one for us.
And I think the one thing that's interesting about that, because if you look at descriptions of Greys, they're typically not described in a way where they have what we would call secondary sex characteristics. They don't have breasts, they don't look like
or
female
not
humans.
obvious
Yeah, they
to
don't
us.
obviously, right. And so a lot of abductees are describing this more as a sort of feeling that
Hmm.
they feel like the talls are
Or more
female.
feminine
Yeah,
feeling, which
exactly.
I'm not sure that that's a great way to describe things because our cultural ideas
Right.
of what
Are
is masculine and what
quite
is
fluid.
feminine are quite
Yes.
fluid and
Yes.
quite just different cross-culturally. And I would imagine could be dramatically different.
Yeah, and I think the thing, I will say that the abductees in these reports are usually very positive or very certain of their gendering of the talls, but I think there's a lot of open question there in terms of if you read into any of what those experiences that they're actually having are,
Mhm.
in the sense that there's a lot of manipulation of what you're seeing. There's people who claim to be, participating in these reproductive procedures with grays where the grays are manipulating what they themselves are seeing. And so if they can manipulate what you're seeing, then who's to say they can't manipulate how they're being
Right.
perceived by you too?
And if they look at our culture and interpret us as being more feeling like females are more benevolent or caring, etc., they may be portraying themselves to us that way
Hmm.
for that reason.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of assumptions again.
Yes, lots of assumptions. If grays are on the one hand, then you have reptilians and to a lesser degree insectoids on the other hand, in terms of like the two big common groups of extraterrestrials that people talk about. And so we have reptilians who are usually described as, the stereotypical kind of lizard people description. All of the sort of conspiracy people
All the
seem to
conspiracy
be
theories
all into the reptilians.
and V, the old, and what was
Mm.
that from? 80s maybe?
Hmm.
The miniseries, the
Yeah.
reptilians kind of taking over. So,
And then we have, the insectoids that are usually described as sort of looking like a large praying mantis or ant, which I think is probably the most terrifying of all of these. And according to some researchers, including David Jacobs, these could be the same. And we're just seeing a difference in how they're described by abductees. And I think
mhm.
if you read his work in particular, and to a lesser degree, John Max, they talk a little bit about like this, like I was saying before, this manipulation of people's minds. And so like I think there's just so many questions about like what people are actually seeing. Like if we take their experiences just with a grain of salt and assume that what they're describing actually happened, the things that they're describing, the way that their minds are being manipulated, the way they're being communicated with telepathically is opening up a lot of questions like, are these distinctions real?
Right.
In the sense that like we're actually looking at different species of beings.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle a little bit with the idea that they're the same, just being described a little different because reptiles and insects
Yeah.
are really, I mean, dramatically
Dramatically
different.
different. Yes.
And when I think of something that looks kind of like a humanoid lizard
Mm-hmm.
versus a praying mantis.
That's
I
drastic.
mean, those are really different pictures in my mind. I would not describe them at all
Right.
similarly.
Yeah.
And so I struggle with that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about the idea that there's a manipulation going
Right.
on, maybe.
Yeah, and so both of these really are often described as being observed alongside typically the short grays and are
Mhm.
usually kind of filling the role of the tall gray. And sometimes you'll see descriptions of people talking about the insectoids as being kind of an almost supervisor to the tall grays, making the tall grays kind of this middle management on the UFO. And there are some stories that include them kind of wearing these elaborate capes and
Mm.
robes with like high collars, like full on Star Wars looking stuff. But those are less common descriptions.
Well, and that brings up the question, and this is completely a theoretical question. Are all of these species coming from the same world?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, is there a world that has multiple types of intelligent life that happen to look really vastly different like this, or are they coming from different worlds
Right.
and coming together in a federation like Star Trek?
Right. Well, because because I think, we operate on the assumptions of everything that we know.
Right.
And what we know is here on Earth, we are if we discount octopi, which like maybe will take over the world.
They might.
we operate under the assumption that like we are the dominant species on the planet,
Right.
and there is no other advanced technological life
So we think that that must be true everywhere
everywhere
else.
else.
And actually, just to throw out the argument, we don't really know what's under the oceans.
No, we don't. In fact,
So, we may not be the only
that's true. That's true.
technologically advanced.
All of these could be from here.
They could be.
If you, follow any of the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis stuff,
Right.
that's the argument, is
Right.
that all of this is
actually from here.
actually from Earth.
Yeah. That's a horrifying thought in so many ways.
Yeah, it's a lot. That's probably the most existential question we're gonna ask today.
But we really have not examined the
No.
oceans. There's so much of the oceans that we don't know what's there.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah.
So what about the Nordics? The Nordics are also talked about fairly regularly.
Yeah.
Not quite as much as the others, but you may have heard them called the Tall Whites. There's the Pleiadians, and some people will say that the Pleiadians are the Nordics. Other people say, well, no, these are two different species. I don't know.
There's a lot of,
there.
like in researching this episode, there's a lot of disagreement about some of these.
Yeah.
And I mean, it makes sense. Of course there is, but, made it kind of hard to narrow this down to what we wanted to essentially talk about.
Right. So we picked a few.
Yeah. Yeah, we did.
But the Nordics are discussed quite a bit. They're described as taller than the average human, an average of 6 or 7 feet. So not tremendously taller,
Right.
but on the taller end, and certainly taller than the average. And with stereotypically Northern European kinds of features. So blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, and that's where you get this term Nordic. That's a very, again, term that would be familiar to us, simply based on how they look. They were first reported in the 1950s by George Adamski, who is a mid-century contactee and author of Flying Saucers Have Landed.
Yeah, and I think, if you go back to, I forget which headlines episode it is, but where we talked about how people would respond to the arrival of extraterrestrial life, and we talked about the idea of UFO religions and things. The Nordics kind of feature in a lot of those. They're a lot more common in the contactee narratives rather than abductee narratives. So that is actually an important distinction in the sense that abductees claim that they've been taken up into extraterrestrial craft, whereas contactees typically talk about like the aliens came down here and talked to them and didn't take them anywhere. And so they typically come out of those groups where they're talking about this idea of kind of being the sort of space brother. And we'll get into kind of why extraterrestrials might be here, because if you follow the contactee narratives, they're a
little bit different.
A little bit different, yeah. But, that said, David Jacobs talks about the Nordics in his book, The Threat, and he really digs into this idea that there is this hybridization program, and his argument is that the Nordics are probably adult hybrids. And he argues that they're probably adult 3rd or 4th generation hybrids. And he really digs into that. And we're not going to talk about that today specifically, but if you're interested in that take, his book, The Threat, is a really good place to start.
All right. So I felt like we would be totally remiss if we didn't mention the Anunnaki.
Yes.
And I will not pretend to be an expert on ancient astronaut theory, but I would love to throw out an invitation to any ancient astronaut theorists out there who would like to come on the podcast, because I'd love to really dig into some of this.
Pick it apart.
Yeah, well, I won't be here, but what I love about them is the fact that they are willing to talk about some of the archaeological evidence that's out there in a non-standard way. And this is obviously a theme of the way that I talk about things.
Yes.
I love people who are willing to look at things differently from a different perspective.
Big, scary question.
Ask the questions and try to think outside the box. So I love that about them. I would love to talk with someone who is a proponent of that. So anyway, the Anunnaki. Why don't you tell us about the Anunnaki?
Yeah, so first, let's start with what we know about the Anunnaki archaeologically. So the Anunnaki, from an archaeological perspective, and we're talking like a standard mainstream archaeological perspective, are a group of deities of ancient Sumeria, Acadia, Assyria, and Babylon. So this is in broadly what's understood as Mesopotamia, which is that area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River and kind of their environs in the
Middle East.
Yeah, in the Middle East. Well, a very particular region in the Middle East.
Yes. The
And
cradle of civilization.
yes, yeah, the cradle, the Fertile Crescent.
The Fertile Crescent.
Actually, that's not included. Yeah, the Fertile Crescent is more inclusive. Anyway, I digress. This is all things that anthropologists really care about, but really aren't that important. Now, if we look at it from the perspective of ancient astronaut theorists, particularly including guys like Eric von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin, they often claim that the Anunnaki could be an ancient race of extraterrestrials. So this is kind of at the core of ancient astronaut theory, really. Right. And so there's this idea that they are this advanced extraterrestrial species from a yet to be discovered planet called Nibiru. Now, if you dig into ancient astronaut theory, where Nibiru falls in the solar system or even in the universe has changed a little bit over the years. But the Anunnaki, from some perspectives among ancient astronaut theorists, is that they hybridized with Homo erectus to create us as humans for the purpose of creating a slave race of gold miners. And this is all detailed in his book, The 12th Planet. So if you want to dig into that, that's where to go. And you don't hear a lot of people, any of this, if there was even a kernel of truth in any of this, this would have massive repercussions for who we are as humans, right?
Well, and there's some genetic evidence that, there are events, time periods in our genetic evolution where there were massive changes to our genetics. And now this can happen naturally. I'm not saying that this couldn't happen in any other way, but a lot of times when you have things like that, you have like a bottlenecking effect, a founder's effect. You have these different things where you have an isolated population. Something happens, there's some sort of mutation, maybe there's some pressure externally from the natural environment. And so you have these massive changes. And there are points in our history, evolutionarily speaking, where that happened. And one of the arguments here is that there's no real way to explain certain massive changes that happened without the introduction of some other type of DNA.
Right.
And so, was it aliens? Well, I think Giorgio Tsoukalos would say absolutely.
Aliens.
Right.
I wish y'all could see my hands.
Right,
Aliens.
exactly. And I love listening to him and others talk because they're so sure of what they're saying.
They are, yeah. And they're so sure in a way that is not, I think, because you could make the argument that their detractors are also equally sure, but they are sure in a way that is incredibly pretentious and arrogant. And I think, ancient astronaut theorists, regardless of where you fall on whether you believe it or not,
right.
They have a certain sureness that is, I don't want to say I don't know what to call it.
It's different.
It's different. Yeah. It's just not, they're so sure, and they will show you all that evidence.
And the evidence is interesting. And if you watch episodes of the show, and we went and saw them in person, and you listen.
We did go see them in person. We went to Ancient Aliens Live, folks.
And it was cool.
It was actually legit. I'm not going to lie.
But you listen, and by the end of an episode, the end of listening to them talk, you're like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's a reason there are that many seasons of Ancient Aliens.
I mean,
the History Channel is basically Ancient Alien Channel. Yeah, there's a reason for that.
You really listen, you're like, wow, that makes such perfect sense.
And it's logical. There is a logic.
There's a logic to it.
I think that's what I was getting at. That there is a logic to it, and it's not just, I'm accepting the facts as they've been fed to me. And I think that's what's nice about their sureness.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the way to say it. And so I think regardless of whether you believe it or not, take a watch, take a listen, hear what they have to say, because it's interesting if nothing else.
Yeah.
And we can all go to Pumapunku and
that's right.
And take a look.
That's right.
I have not been there, and
I haven't either.
I'd love to go.
If one of our listeners wants to take us all to Pumapunku, I'll gladly go to Pumapunku. And so, like I said, we really had to be kind of particular about who we wanted to talk about here, because there are quite a few claimed species of extraterrestrials when you start digging into this. And so if you really want to get into it,
Yeah.
we actually found a book that's published by MUFON called the Extraterrestrial Species Almanac, which we linked in the show notes. And it includes 82 species
Yeah.
of possible
We
extraterrestrials.
thought that would be a really long episode.
That would be, you could make a
You
whole
know,
podcast. You could make an 82 episode series, probably,
probably.
on
Yeah.
that would be a lot. I don't think
I
people
don't,
would listen. I don't know. Would you listen to that? Let us know.
if you would, we'll
If you
do
would,
it,
I'll
you
buy that
know?
book.
Yeah. That I had no idea until we
No,
started
I
looking
didn't
that
either.
up. I had no idea. I figured, oh, there's got to be at least like 20 different ones,
Yeah, I was gonna put it in the ballpark around a dozen or so, but yeah, somewhere around there for
82.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, with these 82 species, one of the questions that we feel the need to ask is, what could their goals be?
Yeah.
Why do they want to come here? And a lot of the possibilities for this are honestly terrifying.
Not great.
There's not a lot of good reasons, but there are some.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
people put a really positive spin on this.
Yeah.
I struggle with the positive spin that some people put on it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah. Well, and so let's start with the positive spin. So
Sure.
I know I kind of alluded to this earlier. Contactee narratives are somewhat distinct, at least in my opinion, from how other folks describe interactions with extraterrestrials. Contactees typically have this more positive and encouraging, and sometimes I'll use the phrase consciousness expanding experience.
That
And
really makes me start thinking about psychedelics.
altered states of consciousness.
Altered states.
Well, yes, but they
And we will do an episode on altered
yes,
states of consciousness.
yes, and most of these contactees really talk about extraterrestrials as wanting to help humankind with its problems. Now, this, depending on who you talk to, can be a lot of different things, whether that's wars or nuclear weapons or climate catastrophe or whatever.
Well, there's lots to choose from.
There's a lot to choose from. I mean, you pick one. And so contactees typically talk about, being told that, it's that they need to go and, communicate to the rest of humankind that all these things are bad or whatever, or that the aliens are here to help us kind of manage those problems, right? But that's kind of where the positive spin stops for the most part. For the most part. Just looking at two of kind of the big figures in the abductee research movement, and I know I'm leaving out Bud Hopkins here, and we just are, for no particular reason, really. You look at Dr. David Jacobs, the thrust of three of his main books is that there is this sort of hybridization program, which is common across lots of abductee narratives, regardless of whether he worked with abductees or somebody else did. But his interpretation of the abductees he's worked with and their experiences is that this program is built to infiltrate and control Earth and humanity from the inside. So to, sort of manufacture these hybrids so that they look enough like us that they can just slip right into human society and we will be none the wiser, and then that they are running the show. And it's interesting because you hear a lot of people who follow that sort of lizard people conspiracy stuff as saying these things, but not in quite the same way. And then, kind of on the other hand, we have John Mack, who did similar work to David Jacobs at the same time. And in fact, both of them were trained, or at least David Jacobs was, trained in hypnotic regression by Bud Hopkins.
But he has got a different take.
He does. He has a different take. I just finished reading Abduction and go to Mulder's bookshelf here in probably a couple of weeks and I'll have the review up. And we may put that on our field notes too. We'll see. He has a take that was, for me, I'll admit, difficult to read after, and maybe this is because I had just read David Jacobs and his stuff lined up with me, or, sort of lined up with what I expected to hear. But also let me digress just for a tiny second. I liked what David Jacobs did methodologically better than John Mack.
And that means that you'll like his conclusion.
And that means something.
Yeah.
Yes, that means something to me. And any other research, anybody who does research, like his data, if you do qualitative research, David Jacobs' data felt much more saturated to me. And that is important for qualitative researchers. For the rest of y'all, you're like, whatever, what are you talking about? Shut up. So anyway.
If you're quantitative, think p-value.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, think p-value.
Honestly, that's how I usually equate it.
Yeah.
If you're talking about saturation of data, you're talking about your p-value.
Yeah.
So if it's saturated, less than 0.05.
Yes.
That's all you need to know.
So what was difficult about what the conclusion he came to was for me was that a lot of the experiences that the abductees that he worked with were having were not that different from the experiences that the abductees that David Jacobs was working with, in the sense that they were, having these, what I will just call sexual assault experiences. They
Well, yeah, if
were,
someone's taking eggs from me, I'm going to call that sexual
yeah,
assault.
right. I mean, all of the sort of abnormal physiological testing and things like that, all of those experiences were largely the same. But his conclusion and the things that his patients were saying,
And this is what's interesting because it's the
patients that
abductees
said it. Yes.
themselves who are saying this. It's not like John Mack overlaying, well, I
No.
think this is no, it's actually coming from the patients. So I find it interesting that each of these researchers are they're getting the same stories with different
Yes.
interpretations from the patients
Yes.
themselves.
Yes.
That's interesting to me.
Yes. And his interpretation was that, basically the aliens are here to help us expand our consciousness and to, in a sense, do similar things to what the contactees are claiming, in the sense that they're protecting us from ourselves, but with the sort of stated purpose of preserving our genetics through this hybridization program to supposedly repopulate the earth after we ultimately destroy ourselves. Now, with that said, while that is like a sticking point for me, that like you can have this extremely traumatic experience, that if someone had this experience with another human, we would never for a second think that it could be anything but traumatic. This piece about protecting us from ourselves and repopulating after we destroy ourselves really plays right into that stuff about
Yeah,
whether or not they're us from the future,
that's true.
which is
That's
kind
true.
of wild.
So it's an interesting take.
Yeah. And then the sort of,
I would want to do my own research, my own interviews
yes,
to say something about that.
yes.
And it's something, well, I couldn't do the hypnotic regression
And that's the
piece.
tricky part, right? Because we've
Um,
talked to abductees
right,
through anomalies,
right.
and actually, I've done all of the interviews. So every single one that I've talked to,
Yeah, we divided up the interviews in an interesting way.
we did. We did. Um,
If you want to talk about demons, come talk to
yeah, you
me.
talk to Chris, I'll deal with all the alien stuff. And if you think they're one and the same, then I guess you can talk to both of us.
That's right. Then come on the podcast.
Then come on the
Let's talk.
podcast. Yeah, let's talk. No matter who I talk to, they didn't always have good recollections of what happened to them during that abduction experience. Some
Right.
people did, but a
But
good
because
portion
of
of folks
that,
did not.
that makes me wonder, the person who's running the hypnotic session, what types of influences they could have
Yeah.
based on the way they're asking questions, things like that. I mean, we know from research that we can
And this
make you
is
say whatever we want.
and this is part of why I like David Jacobs' work better. And it may just be because he's very forthcoming about
Mhm.
those things. So, a little background, David Jacobs is a historian. And I think this is an important piece here because John Max is a psychiatrist. And so David Jacobs is a humanist. I would argue he's more of a social scientist based on the fact that he did this work and the way that he did it, and the way that he describes doing it, because he's very particular about talking about being careful with leading questions and things like that John Mack does not explicitly state. Now, that doesn't mean that he was, asking all sorts of leading questions.
Just are trained in a very
Right.
particular way. So
Exactly. But I think that's worth noting here is that that's a really important question, and I think having read both of their work, David Jacobs is very particular about his methodology. He is very explicitly clear about it. He even talks about there's a strategy, and this is not just in his work. There's a strategy for folks who work with abductees where they ask them these kind of trap questions, more or less, where you ask an abductee if a particular word that's a completely nonsensical word means anything to them, or if they heard that at any point during their experience. And that's kind of a tell
mhm.
to you as the person doing the regression or leading the regression that they may be BSing you and that this
If
could
they
be
know the
real.
word that you just made up.
Right, exactly. So there is that. And then the last sort of, I guess, less than awesome reason for extraterrestrial visiting here would be just to extract resources out of the earth.
Yeah,
And this is kind of,
it makes a lot of sense. We have
oh, it
resources,
totally
you
does.
know.
And this is kind of the typical take from many ancient astronaut theorists, not all of them, but many of them kind of point to this. And the Anunnaki is a great example.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think a lot of our anxieties around what would happen if extraterrestrials showed up here and what they would do to us comes from analogy. It comes from what we know and
Right.
how we know we've treated people that are different from us, who physiologically are not different from us.
Yeah, and that's not always a good,
And that's
happy
like
place.
a really, yeah, that's like a really less than awesome headspace to be in, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's where some of this comes from, where, people are worried about it's because, well, we know what we've done to each other.
Right. And we go looking for resources. Anytime you have two civilizations butting up against each other, when you have conflict happening, it's over some sort of resource.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, that could be what's going on here. And it could be that extraterrestrials are coming here with the explicit intention of taking all the water on the earth, because that actually water would be a resource that it would make a lot of sense. It's actually unusual to find water in its
These
in
quantities.
these quantities in the liquid state in a
Yeah.
natural environment and all that. So that would be one. I mean, the gold thing, I don't know how I feel about, but it is a resource.
Yeah, it's a
But
resource.
there's lots of different resources, and I mean, who knows? Gold could be, a
It's useful
food,
for electronics.
but it could be a food for a species.
True.
Like who
That would
knows?
be,
So,
one.
yeah, I mean, so we don't know what resources they might be looking for, but there are certainly plenty of resources on the planet,
Hmm. Hmm.
at least for now, before we finished destroying them.
Yeah, at the time of recording.
Right. So this brings us to the question of ethics.
Hmm.
And, to me, anytime you talk about research of any kind,
Hmm.
ethics comes in. So if we're talking about doing extraterrestrial ethnography or, studying another culture
Hmm.
of extraterrestrials, what are the ethics of this?
Yeah.
You know, how do we even think about what those ethics are when we're talking about a completely foreign culture?
Right. Hmm.
So we have to, of course, sort of start looking within to our own field. So
Hmm.
when you look at anthropology and the history of anthropology, um, we haven't always been seen in a very positive light.
Hmm.
And
There are good portions of the world still today that do not think too highly of
yeah, I
anthropologists.
mean, I have been known to walk into a community that I start working with and immediately sort of saying, I'm an anthropologist. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
And I'm
Not
not
actually an
I'm not
anthropologist.
apologizing for myself. I didn't do anything.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Um, but
But for the
people from
baggage that
my
comes with our field.
right, people who have been in my field and have gone out to different communities have done some pretty unethical things. And so, what are some of those things?
Well, I mean, I think, like we just said, there are mountains of examples of human cultures running into cultures of that are different than their own and having really less than awesome results. And anthropologists have been part of that process almost since we were a discipline, and even to a degree before we were an official discipline. Right. There
Yeah.
were, sort of pseudo anthropologists running around, whether they were, you know, Christian missionaries or whatever else. And I mean, it's to the point where, anthropology is known to some people as kind of the handmaiden of colonialism. Anthropology has been used by governments for all sorts of nefarious purposes throughout our history. And I have a hard time believing that the arrival of extraterrestrials would not be added to that list.
Well, I mean, let's use an example from the biological end, just because cultural always gets picked on.
Yeah, that's true.
The von Luschen skin scale.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
this was a skin scale, and what it was colors of skin.
Yep.
And you could match up, I'm not kidding, you could match up someone's skin tone onto this scale, and it would show you their intelligence level.
Yeah.
And so it was developed by folks with lighter skin,
Imagine
Northern Europe, and all of the skin tones that were lighter in color, with pinker undertones, were more intelligent. Those with more of an olive undertone, like, I don't know, people like me, um, from Southern
that. Mm-hmm.
Europe,
Mm-hmm.
were not as intelligent. People with brown or black skin tones, not as intelligent. People with a yellow undertone to their skin, say Asians, tended to be on the higher end.
Mm-hmm.
And they would match this up and say, look, we have proof of this because we ran IQ tests
Yep.
developed by the same people.
Yep. How
Interesting.
convenient.
Yeah. And we show clearly that people with these lighter skin tones
Hmm.
have higher intelligence scores. Well, when you use two scales that have been developed by the same people, you're measuring something that you created. So
Right.
that's kind of an interesting way of doing things. We actually know that IQ scales really don't tell us much of anything.
Right. Yep.
So neither did the evolution skin scale, by the way.
Yeah.
But it was used for a long time to make policy decisions and other types of decisions that have caused a lot of human suffering.
Hmm.
And so that's just one example of something that came out of the larger field of anthropology that really didn't have great results.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we can, I mean, the foundation of American anthropology started with, Franz Boas debunking this idea that we can measure people's skulls and
Measuring skull.
determine, how smart a population
That's
is.
phrenology.
Yeah, technically, yeah, it's
Yeah.
phrenology. And, that was that's where American anthropology started, right? But that's not to say that it wasn't great from then on, because I mean we have examples too from the period around World War II. Ruth Benedict's famous Chrysanthemum and the Sword was an ethnography that she conducted during World War II for the U.S. Office of War Information. And famously, Ruth Benedict never went to Japan.
Yeah, which that goes against anthropology,
It's
by
just
the way.
wild. She never went to Japan. She did do some interviews with some POWs, but that's not, enough to characterize an entire country worth of people with its own, cultural differences within it. And I think the thing that's wild about the Chrysanthemum and the Sword is that it's one of the most famous ethnographies in the history of anthropology,
Yeah.
and it's massively popular in Asia
It
still
really is.
today. Like
Yeah.
there's all sorts of studies about how the writing of that book then influenced the way that Japanese people saw themselves and continue to see themselves. And so we have examples of anthropology being used presumably for good. We even have more recent examples, like in the early 2000s in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, something that was developed by the U.S. military that was called the Human Terrain System. And the idea behind this was that American military needed to find ways to engage with people in countries where we were waging war in a way that was culturally competent and was able to build relationships with people in these countries that we were actively occupying.
Yeah. I mean, I remember in graduate school people
Yeah.
talking about this. Now, so just to place myself, I got my doctorate in 2004, and they were talking about this while I was in graduate school, that the military was actively recruiting
Hmm.
anthropologists
Yep.
and specifically looking for people who studied cultures in the Middle East.
Yep.
I think there was also some mention of particular Asian cultures as well,
Hmm.
but there was this idea that, this was a job opportunity because even back in the early 2000s, the job market for people with PhDs in anthropology was not great.
Still not great.
Still not great. Um, but this was a job opportunity. And then this system really officially started a little bit later. It
Mhm.
was 2007 to about 2014
Yeah.
when this was being done. But they were recruiting a bit before then to
Mm.
really convince anthropologists that this was something to do, and it was a job opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean this was, kind of a point of contention within the field. There's examples of, the American Anthropological Association publishing a whole statement.
It's the
Uh,
other AAA.
yeah, the other triple A, that's right. Publishing a whole statement against this, calling it, quote, an unacceptable application of anthropological expertise. And I mean, you'll still find today people that kind of argue a counterpoint to that. And you can see some of this. There's a documentary about it called Human Terrain, War Becomes Academic. It's available on YouTube and we'll link it in the show notes. And I will give you fair warning, it is not the most engaging of documentaries, but it does do a really good job of it's not, but it does do a great job of really showing both sides of the argument, and it
Mhm.
follows the story of a guy who was a PhD anthropologist and ended up, being a part of the system and, sort of I won't spoil it for you, but kind of what happens to him as he's, involved and talks to people from the military side of things who were like, well, this is great. We're not good at this. And, it's annoying. I will say just from a personal perspective, it's annoying that that's the one time people are like, oh yeah, we need anthropologists for this. It's like, come on. There's like so many other good places where you could be like, I could really use an anthropologist.
We can be
Why?
useful in
Yeah, we
other
can be useful in lots of different arenas,
yeah.
folks. So, it's worth thinking about in the sense that if an extraterrestrial intelligence arrives on Earth or communicates with us, what will happen because of, what will happen because of those interactions, and how will we navigate those interactions, and what, why are we learning about extraterrestrial culture? What's the purpose there, right? We talk about a lot in contemporary anthropology about, understanding and bridging cultural difference, which, is, I think it's a little bit rose-colored, but at its core, it's about people being able to communicate with each other and sharing in the human experience,
Mhm.
not, being able to exploit these other folks, which really was kind of at the core of the human terrain system to a certain degree, right? They
Right.
put this nice veneer over it that it's like going to protect human soul or American soldiers and all this, but at its core, it was about, being able to continue the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it's tricky, right? And I think it's really important for us as anthropologists and other researchers, and for folks who aren't, to think about, what does it mean for us when we think about how we would interact with an extraterrestrial intelligence.
Yeah, so that brings us to sort of a conclusion for this, and I'm going to take ownership of this. I added this very pessimistic conclusion to our episode. Um, and I am going to go with it because I feel like it's important to say. So, at the end of the day, all of this hinges on some things. And we've talked a lot about assumptions.
Hmm.
And we make a series of assumptions as humans, and I call it in our arrogance.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
I
that's fair.
I think we are incredibly arrogant as a species.
Yeah, just in general.
You know. So first off, we assume that extraterrestrial life would be like us, and we've talked about this, or at least somewhat humanoid. And you mentioned the pluribus example of where it's not humanoid, and I don't know if we should give the spoiler.
Yeah, so if you
Go
haven't
ahead,
seen
give the
spoiler,
spoiler.
go ahead and skip ahead like 10, 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Essentially what happens in Pluribus is that the extraterrestrial life in this instance is actually a viral agent that turns all human life into a hive mind, with a few key exceptions, and that's, the plot of the show. But the purpose of this viral agent is then of, using this hive mind or humanity to send this genetic code into the universe via other satellites. And the presumption is, in the show, that this has happened on other planets. And they don't really dig into that. But while we were writing this episode, I was also watching Pluribus, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is like totally overlaps what we're
Yes.
talking about. And
Yes.
that is absolutely wild. And
That's
so
a
that's,
thing that sometimes we
yeah,
overlook.
yeah, I think some would call it a synchronicity. And, so we assume that that extraterrestrial life is going to look like us or be at least similar to
Right.
us. But it could be a case like that where it totally rewires us as a species. And then what does that mean?
We also assume that we would survive first contact. And that includes surviving if this extraterrestrial life wants to kill us or diseases that
Hmm.
we interact with. So we assume that we're going to survive this. We then make the assumption that extraterrestrial intelligent life would care about us.
Hmm.
We assume that they would see us as intelligent life.
Right.
It could be that extraterrestrial life sees us and they're like, well, they're not intelligent. We don't care. Or if they are intelligent, we still don't care.
And if you look at the way we treat each other on a planet, I mean,
Right.
that's not a big
That's
leap.
no, it's not. So we're making these assumptions. We also assume that we would be the ones studying them
Hmm.
instead of the other way around, which, if you look at the abductee kinds of thing, reports and things, maybe not.
Yeah.
And we assume that we would be given the chance to study them.
Hmm.
And my conclusion to all of that is these are really, really bad assumptions.
Yep.
So, on that positive note, I'm all about the assumptions, and we make a lot of them here.
Yeah, I think it's really important
Yeah.
for, particularly with the conversation around aliens, because
Yeah.
I think, I mean, we make a lot of assumptions around the paranormal in general, but I think with aliens in particular, they're really important for how we understand the possibilities for things like disclosure and things like that. They really can, like, our assumptions really shape. I mean, our assumptions shape everything, but
Mhm.
our assumptions around extraterrestrials really shape the way that we think we would possibly interact with them. And that's an important thing for us as people who are interested in aliens or whatever else to really consider.
And never make an assumption about how you would interact with someone or how you would act in any situation
Hmm.
until you've been in it.
Right.
So we'll see.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us as we went on this existential journey through what it will mean for aliens to arrive or, communicate with us,
Anthropologists
to
anyway.
anthropologists anyway, and we hope it was interesting to you. Our next episode, we're going to be taking a little bit of a detour from the things we've been talking about lately, and we'll justify this in the episode. You'll have to join us to find out. But we're going to be talking about a Mexican Catholic folk saint known as La Santa Muerte. And you may have heard of her, but in case you haven't, join us as we dive into everything about her and her devotees. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Human, where the strange, the supernatural, and the deeply human collide. If today's journey into the unknown sparked your curiosity, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with fellow seekers of the extraordinary.
Have a story, question, or theory of your own? Reach out. We want to hear how the paranormal shapes your world, too. You can find us online at Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep thinking beyond the human.